Hey everyone, thank you guys for being here. My name is Mark Meckler, and I'm the co-founder of Convention of States. This wild ride began back in 2013. My political background is I came out of the Tea Party movement. I was one of the early adopters and founders of the National Tea Party movement. And in 2012, we had flipped the largest swing class in the history of Congress since 1938, and nothing happened. And I was completely horrified and totally demoralized, to be honest with you. My wife and I had kind of invested our whole life at that point in politics. I'd quit practicing law. I'd done the full head-first dive into politics. And when nothing changed out of something so extraordinary, I was broken because I looked at our system and all I knew is you're supposed to elect good people, and then they go to Washington, D.C. and they do the good things that you expect them to do, and then the country is saved. That was my 8th grade civics education, right? And it didn't work, and we were horrified. On a personal level, we personally invested so much, I literally shut down my law practice, took us to the edge of bankruptcy, and we were doing it just because we believed in what we were doing. And then on a political level, to do the things that you're supposed to do and see government not change was just stunning to us. And so I was getting ready to leave politics, and luckily I had a friend who's now on my board of directors who said, you can't leave politics, you just can't. And I said, no, I actually can. It's pretty easy, I'm looking forward to it. And he said, look, you don't like politics, you don't like politicians, you're not trying to be famous from it, you're not trying to get rich from it, you're exactly the kind of person who should be involved in politics. And we started talking about what we could do to save the country, and my answer was I had no idea, he had no idea, and he volunteered as a donor to help us figure it out, to spend the money, to sponsor an effort to try to figure it out. And that's when I crossed paths with Mike Ferris. Mike Ferris is the founder of the homeschool movement in America. He also founded Patrick Henry Christian College outside of Washington, D.C. He was the president of Alliance Defending Freedom over the last 5 or 6 years, co-counsel on the Dobbs case. That's pretty good, right? So overturned Roe versus Wade. And he said to me that my approach to politics was completely wrong. And he said it was wrong because what I thought the problem was, which was true, was the people in D.C. were bad. And that if you could just fill D.C. with good people, then everything would be okay. And he said that's just wrong. He said we broke our system of governance. Our system of governance was actually designed to absorb people who weren't so great. And the reason was people aren't so great. So it doesn't matter whether you're in your church or in your school or in your workplace. It's filled with human beings, and we're all sinners and we're all flawed, and everybody's got egos and everybody has conflicting interests. And that's always going to be Washington, D.C. But the framers created a structure that was intended to handle all of that, and checks and balances intended to handle all of that. And he said we'd broken that structure, and if we didn't fix that structure, it didn't really matter who we sent to Washington, D.C. And that resonated with me. I understand a lot of you guys run businesses, you run ranches and farms, and you know if your systems are wrong, you can hire good people and put them inside a broken system, you're going to get a broken result, right? And so that's what started Convention of States, this idea that we could use Article 5 to fix the structure of government. Not enough to just put good people. Now, we always should put the best people we can in office, no matter what, whether that's locally or all the way up to the president. We should fight for and elect the best people we possibly can. But if we don't fix the structure, we're not going to fix what ails the country. So that's what I have been doing for the last 12 years of my life now. It's been an incredible journey. We're in every state. We have leadership in every state. I would say most of them not as good as we have here in South Dakota, but we have leadership in every state. And we have state teams on the ground in every state that do this work that you see happening right here. So you guys are in it, deep in it, and I admire that. This is the hardest work on the ground in a state, in a legislature, while it's going on. This is the hardest thing there is to do in American politics, in my opinion, the groundwork of politics. But when I step back, when I sit at home at my desk, I live outside of Austin, Texas, I'm watching 50 states. Now, I'll tell you, this time of year, it's crazy. The grassroots are going wild in all 50 states, and it doesn't matter whether you're talking California or New York or New Jersey or Texas. So I want to give you some of the highlights of what's going on around the country right now. Somebody asked earlier about what was going on in Kansas. We passed the Kansas legislature with a simple majority, which is all it takes. Unfortunately, the Kansas Constitution contains something that says it requires a 2/3 majority to pass a call for a convention of states. So a really weird thing in their Constitution was put in their Constitution in 1974. That year might sound suspect to you. If it doesn't, it's the year after Roe versus Wade. And they did a major constitutional rewrite in 1974. We've looked into this and done all the research. Former regional director Dave Schneider is from Kansas. He did all the research, pulled all the records. Massive debate about this constitutional rewrite in 1974. Not one word written about this amendment that increased their threshold to 2/3. We call it the Protect Roe Amendment that was put in the Kansas Constitution. We believe, and I believe for sure, it's unconstitutional. In other words, a state cannot restrict the exercise of a federal right to call a convention of states. And so that had to be litigated. So we passed there, but there are two legislators, one in the House, one in the Senate, that have chosen to litigate this and to say that that is unconstitutional according to the Supremacy Clause. Right now, we're just waiting for the court to decide. All the briefing's done, everything's in. I think we win that case. This year in Kansas, we're running again. We believe we have the 2/3 majority in the Senate, right? I think we're going to pass even with the 2/3. It's always been close in both houses. The House is more of a stretch. Hopefully we get the court decision. We don't need the 2/3 in the House. House had it in their rules previously also. That's now not in their rules this year. So it's going to be an interesting year. I think we end up passing Kansas this year. North Carolina is an interesting state for us. We passed the House multiple years in a row. We can never even get out of committee in the Senate. We've always struggled with that. We think we found the secret recipe for passing the North Carolina legislature, the North Carolina Senate, in South Dakota. That's weird, isn't it? Like, why does South Dakota have any effect on North Carolina? I'll tell you why, because we brought the Senate president pheasant hunting in South Dakota. You know, whatever it takes is what I say. So we were out in Gettysburg. Rick and I go do a pheasant hunt at Paul Nelson Farm every year. Politicians come from all over the world, or all over the country, and we have donors come and other folks, media figures. Tucker was out there on this hunt. But it was a chance for us to build relationship. And this is a really important theme that runs through convention of states, is we actually know the people we're working with in legislatures. We care about them. It's not just that we want their vote. We want to know what's important to them, and we try to work with them. So this was a chance for Rick and I to build a little bit of a relationship in North Carolina. I'm hoping that that helps North Carolina make it through both the House and Senate in the coming year. Idaho looks really interesting. I think we have lots of support in the Idaho legislature. That's been a very contentious state. The biggest problem we have in Idaho is a problem that you have here with Convention of States, which is the John Birch Societies. We call them the JBS, John Birch Society. So we have a problem with them all over the country. They say the same thing over and over again. 12 years ago when I got started and we used to get attacked by the John Birch Society, I would be very gentle in how I deal with them. I considered them people of good faith who were just wrong on the issue. I'll be honest with you, I have a completely different approach with the John Birch Society today. They're dishonest. They lie about us constantly. They smear us. They say horrible things about us. And unbelievably, and this is really important for you to know, and for the legislators who are here, this is super important. The John Birch Society stands with George Soros, La Raza, MoveOn.org, Planned Parenthood, every America-hating, baby-killing, communist-loving organization in the United States of America is against calling a convention of states. So for your fellow legislators that might say, well, you know, John Birch Society says, and I'm against convention of states, I don't know about you guys. I assume everybody in this room is a conservative. I am. I'm a right-wing, red-blooded, gun-toting, Bible-thumping, Tea Party kind of guy. And I have never woken up on a single day in my entire life and looked in the mirror and thought, wow, it's super weird that I'm standing with George Soros and Planned Parenthood. And if I did, I would think, man, I must be doing something wrong. Like, something's weird about this. I got to figure out what's going on. Why am I on their side? So that's where we sit. That's a problem in Idaho. I think we might overcome it this year. We have a problem with the party there, but I think we've got a pretty good vote count in both houses. So we're looking at Iowa is a really interesting state for us, and not a John Birch Society state, but just getting to the numbers in Iowa. It's a big legislature. That's been a little slow. I think we have a good shot in Iowa. Ohio looks really good for us this year. The Ohio legislature, both houses have leadership that's very favorable to Convention of States. Our sponsors have risen up into leadership. This is one of the things that happens when you do politics over a 10 or a 12-year period. And this is something that I've really learned a lot about from Rick Santorum, who you're going to hear a lot more wisdom from than you get from me, is that it just takes time. You know, sometimes we want it. In fact, always we want it right now, right? I wanted to call a Convention of States 12 years ago. But it just takes time to educate people, to build relationships, to be there year after year, to go into a legislature and let them know you're going to be around. I heard somebody told me that one of the legislators said to them this week, I just want this to go away. And I said, there's an easy solution to that, right? Just pass it. All of the reality is we're not going to go away. Our folks will stick around to help you out afterwards and to do other stuff with you, other things that you think are important conservative things. I want to point sort of to the national scene also and just talk about how this relates to what's going on nationally right now. You might have people who say to you, well, we have Donald Trump in the White House. Things are incredible right now. All these executive orders coming out. Everything's changing. Everything's better. DEI is dead. CRT is dead. Transgender wild madness is dead. And the answer is, praise God, I'm super excited about all of that stuff. But I was also alive for the last 4 years, right? And if you saw Donald Trump in his first term, I don't think he did anywhere near what he's doing right now, but he did a bunch of great stuff. And then they all got erased in 5 minutes by Joe Biden. And we're fooling ourselves if we believe there will never be another Democrat administration. There'll never be another Democrat president, never be another Democrat Congress. They will come back and they will erase almost everything that Donald Trump is doing right now. Not all of it, like Donald Trump had a permanent impact on the courts, thank God. That's a really good thing that's stuck around. But most of it, they just now use executive orders to just wipe stuff off the slate and start over again. I'll give you an example. One of the things that Donald Trump has talked about doing that I think is really important is doing away with the Department of Education. Anybody think that's a good idea? Yeah. Okay, so I'm skeptical. Let me just say that. Ronald Reagan, by the way, said he was doing away with the Department of Education. I famously remember Secretary Bennett saying, I am the first cabinet secretary ever appointed with the mandate to do away with my department, right? And when Bill Bennett left office and Ronald Reagan left office, the Department of Education was bigger than when they got to Washington, D.C. So God bless Donald Trump, and I hope it's different and he does away with the Department of Education. But let's say he does away with it. What do you think happens 5 minutes after we have the next president? There will be a new Department of Education with twice the budget, 5 times. They'll say we have to spend 5 times as much money because of all the damage that Donald Trump did doing away with the Department of Education. So we need to make that permanent. We need to put that into the Constitution. A lot of the things that the president is going to try to do and maybe gets done can be erased very quickly, and we need to make sure that they can't be erased. We need to cement this legacy for the long term. I think it's going to happen. I think it's going to happen here in South Dakota. I think you guys are going to make that application, and I think it's going to happen in the long term. And not because we're so great, you're so great, but the reason I think this is I look at the things that are happening in Washington, D.C. right now, and all the things that are happening that make it look like COS is on the move that we didn't do. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. I look at this administration, I look who's coming into this administration. I look at a guy like J.D. Vance. Anybody enjoying watching J.D. Vance handle the media? Yeah, Ben Shapiro says he was made in a laboratory to handle left-wing media. The guy's he's been awesome. He's got a great conservative philosophy. I mean, he's really well-grounded, really smart, quoting some of the stuff that he said theologically in the last week's been absolutely mind-blowing. He's a sophisticated guy. He's a Convention of State supporter. Pete Hegseth, our new Secretary of Defense, anybody like that guy? He's a Convention of State supporter. The nominee for Ag Secretary, I think she's going to probably fly through, is Brooke Rollins. She's a Convention of State supporter. Mike Huckabee, he's going off to be ambassador to Israel. He's the very first Convention of State supporter as a public figure outside of me and Mike Ferris. Incredible to have him on board. Anybody enjoying watching Caroline Leavitt at the podium as press secretary? Is that awesome? So when she was running for Congress in New Hampshire, she's a Convention of State supporter. So I look at this in Washington, D.C., and I think, wow, there's all these people in D.C. who are surrounding the president, which is the pinnacle of power right now, where a lot of good conservative stuff going on, and they're all Convention of State supporters. We actually got a call from a congressman this week, former state legislator in Missouri, and he said to us, hey, I want to introduce something into Congress, locking in what Congress is allowed to do and not do according to conventions. And we didn't seek this, by the way. There's a congressman who reached out to us and said, is there something we can do to kill this myth of the runaway and the potential for the runaway? So we've been working with them on potentially drafting some language that they might use. By the way, there can't be a runaway. Congress has no control. They have no role to play other than calling the convention and naming mode of ratification. But if we can make people feel better about that by Congress saying, yeah, we don't have any of those powers, more power to us, right? So I think that this year is lined up to be an incredible year. I think there are a lot of states that we could potentially pass. Did I lose that? I have a big enough mouth. It's okay. Is it back? Yeah, there we go. We have a lot of states we can potentially pass. The grassroots are on the move. I think there's momentum towards what we're doing in Washington, D.C. I think it's plausible. I'm not going to say this is going to happen. I think it's plausible that Donald Trump ends up mentioning convention of states. By the way, we know for sure that Donald Trump saw convention of states this week. I don't know if you guys got this. Kind of funny. Rick and I were talking about this on the way in. Mark Levin is a good friend of ours, and Levin on Life, Liberty, and Levin this week was doing this thing where he's talking about what a great conservative president Donald Trump is and is going to be. And he said possibly the greatest conservative president of the modern era. And Levin said, look, I know what I'm talking about. I want to give you my personal credentials as a conservative in the movement for 50 years. And he laid out his credentials. It was really, he was saying, I'm not bragging. I just want you to know I've been around this movement for a long time. And he talked about being chief of staff for Attorney General Meese and all his stuff he's done through the movement. And he brought up convention of states. And he said, and I'm one of the people who worked with and still works with convention of states, and put a picture of me and Mark together. And then Donald Trump truthed that on his social media network, Truth Social. So that went out to his whole base, and that was at about minute 40. So sometimes the president doesn't have the longest attention span, but we're pretty sure he saw convention of states. So I don't know if the president is going to do anything about it. I don't know if he's going to say anything about it. We have a lot of friends that are inside the administration, close to him, that think he should to confirm and secure his legacy over the long haul. So there's a lot of great stuff going on around the country right now. I think we're on the move. I think you're going to pass here. I think we're going to see a bunch of states pass. And this year, for me personally, I'll close with this and turn it over to Rick, has been extra motivational. You think doing it 12 years, don't you get burned out? Well, I always find a way to be motivated. It's usually you guys who motivate me. But this year, something happened in my life that changed everything for me. And that is, I had my first grandchild. Any grandparents in the room? Yeah. It changes your life, right? And something really amazing happened the first time I held her. So I have two kids, both married. This is my first grandchild. And I picked up little Laurel and I held her. And I remember holding my kids when they were first born and how I felt, but this felt completely different. And I remember holding my kids and thinking, I'm always going to be here for you. I'm always going to protect you, whatever it takes. You look at that kid and they're so vulnerable. And you can think about it and really probably for a majority of their lives, you're going to be around. And you're going to be around there to be the backstop if they need you, to be the advice they need when they need it. Maybe they need financial assistance. Maybe they get into trouble, whatever. My dad passed away in February of last year. I was 61 years old when he passed away. He was 85, so that means for the majority of my life that I'll live, he was around. He was there for me. He was my mentor, my friend. And so I look at my kids that way, and I know that. I looked at Lorelei, my little granddaughter, and I thought, that's not true. I'm not going to be here for most of her life. I'm 62 now. She's not even 1 year old. If I lived to 92, maybe I got 30 years with her. And she's going to be a young adult. And she's going to be out there in the world, and whatever the politics are in the world at that time, that's her problem. And hopefully her husband's problem. And her family. It's not going to be me. There's nothing I can do. And the reality is probably I won't be doing politics when I'm 92. So I don't know how many years I have to help make things right in this country for my granddaughter. But my mind raced forward, and I thought, you know what? All of us have been saying for 30 years we want term limits. I want that to be her fight. That's not fair. That's our fight. We look at the budget, and the budget with $37 trillion in debt. If you look at unfunded liabilities, maybe it's $160 trillion. I don't want that to be her fight. That's not fair. That's my fight. That's your fight. That's our fight. She'll have her own fights for liberty, but that should not be her fight. And out of control, out of bounds, outside the Constitution, federal government, that should not be her fight. It's not fair. To say, you're going to be 30 years old, and I'm not going to be around, I'm just going to leave you with all that stuff. Sorry, did the best we could do. That's not right. So I feel more impetus than ever before to solve the problems that we face right now, to do absolutely everything that we possibly can. Reagan said that liberty is not passed down in the bloodstream, that every generation has to fight for it. She'll have her own fight. It's okay, but it shouldn't be our fight. So I'm here to make sure that we finish the stuff that we started, that we leave a better country for our kids than we got, and that she can go fight her own fights at that point. And I'm going to pass it over to Rick, the guy who's been fighting a lot longer in politics than I can, one of my mentors and my good friend, Senator Rick Santorum.
Thank you. It's first off, thank you all for coming. For the Grassroots folks, can't tell you how much we appreciate it. I know there are legislators here, and I'm sure they would all tell you that there's no more influential lobbyists for any issue that they deal with than hearing it from the folks back home. I served in the House and Senate in Washington for 16 years, and I always try to. I can't even tell you how many town hall meetings, but what the folks back home said have an impact on you, and so we wouldn't be anywhere close to passing here in South Dakota if it wasn't for the great work Shirley and the entire gang. So first, thank you. Thanks for coming out tonight. For the members of the legislature here, thank you for obviously taking your time to come. You guys come and hear speeches all the time. To actually come to an event to hear speeches, God bless you. That's very, very kind of you to do. I'll try my best to get to the point, and then I will open it up for questions if you have any questions for anybody. But thank you. Thanks for coming out. I'll just give you just my 2 cents. I mean, Mark gave the history, did a great job of going through all that sort of stuff. I want to sort of talk to you about the urgency. Because people are saying, well, this has been around for a while and it's kicking around, and it has. But I just want to give you as a perspective of someone who's been involved in public in Washington, D.C. now for 34 years. I was elected when I was 32 years old. Do the math. And I won a race I was never supposed to win. Got elected to Congress. Got reelected. I beat a Democratic incumbent. Got reelected in 1992. Beat another Democratic incumbent. Got elected in 1994. Beat another Democratic incumbent for the Senate. So I have a pretty good track record of taking on big battles that are almost impossible to win and winning them. And I went, got to the Senate, and when I was in the House, I was part of a group called the Gang of Seven. You may or may not remember them, but we were John Boehner and myself and Jim Nussle from Iowa and a group of others. We were freshmen, and we rocked that place. We took down the facade of 40 years of Democratic control and turned it over, and we led to the Republican Revolution in 1994. Would not have happened but for these 7 freshman congressmen who were willing to stand up and fight for the right thing. And the reason I was able to beat 2 Democratic incumbents, how do you beat 2 Democratic incumbents back-to-back in the House? Redistricting happened in 1992, and they took my district because I was a rabble-rouser in the House. They took my district and blew it into 3 parts, and they put me in with a 28-year Democratic incumbent, 70% of his district, and the district was almost 68% Democrat. And in that year, in 1992, George Bush in my district running for president got 29% of the vote. I got 61. You are looking right now, just fast forward to when I got to the Senate, I was the lead author on the welfare reform bill. You want to talk about cutting spending? The only entitlement that's ever been ended in Washington, D.C., major entitlement ever been ended, was aid to families with dependent children, AFDC. That was ended with the 1997 welfare reform bill, which I was the principal author. I was the floor manager on the floor of the Senate, my 2nd year in the Senate. How do we get that done? We put a block grant to the states called TANF. You guys all know what TANF is if you're in the legislature, right? We sent a block grant to the state in 1997. Here's how I got it done. How did I get it done? I got it done by actually saying to all the states, look, we're not going to cut your money. We're just going to give you a block grant, and then you guys can use that money. It's pure federalism. And that's what I believed in when I went to Washington, D.C. Get the power of the money back to the states. So we did pure federalism. Anybody want to tell me how many times the federal government has raised the TANF grant since 1997? Never. We are spending the same amount on welfare in Washington, D.C. as we spent in 1997. Name another federal program where that's the case. I'm just telling you, look, it can work, but it doesn't work. And the reality is, we tried to cut other entitlements, we never even get close. Food stamps should be doing the same. All these other, we can't get them done. It's been so divided. You're looking at the last person to win a Senate race in this country as a conservative in a year in which the president of your party, the Republican presidential nominee, lost the state. I'm the last one. I won Pennsylvania in 2000. George Bush lost it by 4. I won it by 5. There hasn't been a conservative since who's won a state where our nominee lost. I'm sharing that with you because I'm not some guy off the turnip truck coming to tell you, boy, you need to do this. I'm someone who has effectively won as a conservative, fought as a conservative, led the nation as a leader in the United States Senate as a conservative, ran for president as a conservative. In 2012, I took on Mitt Romney. For those of you who supported him, I told you so. But I ran against Mitt Romney as a conservative, but as a different kind of conservative. I wrote a book about the kind of conservative I was right after that election. And the book is called Blue Collar Conservative. I ran to bring manufacturing back to this country. I ran saying tariffs weren't a bad thing. I ran saying that we need to secure our southern border. And these are starting to sound familiar. And by the way, I wrote that book in 2014. I was on the radio, and I got a call after being on a radio station in New York, and guess who called me? Donald Trump. 2 months later, I met with Donald Trump. And I walked into his office. He was sitting behind his desk holding a copy of my book. And he said, I read your book. I said, no, you didn't read my book. He said, I read your book. Great book. And I said, the hell you read my book? He said, someone needs to run for president on this book. I said, well, as a matter of fact, I don't know. I'm thinking of doing that again. He said, so am I. And we spent an hour talking about my book. So I'm just telling you, I know people are coming, oh, Rick Santorum's a rhino, and Rick Santorum's not, doesn't represent what conservatives think. Rick Santorum is none of those things. Look it up. And I'm coming here because I need help in South Dakota to fix something I've been working on for 35 years and failing. People ask me why I'm still doing this. Now I'm semi-retired. And the reason is because I failed. You can point to all the successes, you can look at all the victories I've had, but I failed. You can say I ushered Donald Trump in, but Washington is worse now than it's ever been. I left the United States Senate. You know what the deficit was when I left the debt was when I left the United States Senate? $8 trillion. It's now almost $38 trillion. If I thought the answers were in Washington, I wouldn't be in Pier. No offense. Not that I don't love Januaries and Februaries in Pier. It's great. But I wouldn't be here. But this is a problem that is only going to get worse. We are on the precipice of something that's going to change this country forever unless we do something quickly to fix it. Mark talked about the structure. There was a structure. People wave their pocket constitution and say, oh, don't change this, it was perfect. That's great. Except it has been changed 27 times. Because it wasn't perfect. And by the way, most of the changes, those 27 amendments, we live by them. Katie's still allowed, you're allowed to vote, right? Yep, that was an amendment to the Constitution. We limit presidents to 2 terms. There's an amendment to the Constitution. If you look at the 27 amendments, particularly the 17 since the founding, this first 10 were part of the really founding document. Every single one of those, except one, which was repeal prohibition, we live by. So when people say, oh, well, if you do this, people won't live by it. If you propose amendments and changes, people won't live by it. False. Presidents serve 2 terms. Vice presidents can remove presidents. All of those things are still used and held to. Why? Why? Very simply. Because to pass a constitutional amendment requires super broad consensus of the country. Because you need 75% of the state legislatures to vote for it, which means you need probably 80% of the people to be for it. And so when you have something that overwhelmingly supported, then Congress can say, oh, we're not going to pay attention to that. The courts can say, oh, we're not going to pay attention to that. They pay absolute attention to those things. You say, well, 150 years later, they've messed around with the 13th Amendment. Fine. If we get an amendment next year that lasts for 150 years, I'm good with that. Anybody bad with that? I'm good with that. The reality is, if we don't do something now, I will tell you exactly what will happen. Not in the next 4 years, say doubt sometime. But after Donald Trump is gone, assume this. Not unlikely, would sort of be the norm in America these days. It swings back the other way. And the Democrats get elected president, win the United States Senate, and win the House of Representatives. And we just had that. But we had a situation where 2 Democratic senators decided they weren't going to do something that would fundamentally change this country, and that is eliminate the filibuster in the United States Senate. And why do I say that would fundamentally change America? Because the United States Senate was the mechanism by which America changed from the founding. The founding, you elected the United States Senators, the state legislatures. Up until 1912, with the 17th Amendment, legislators elected senators, and senators did what the legislature wanted, which was not let Washington take your power. And as a result, Washington, D.C. in 1912, as Woodrow Wilson complained, was a weak, powerless city with no money and no power. And then the 17th Amendment came, an amendment to the Constitution that the American public followed, because we still elect our senators through popular vote. And guess what? 5 years later, they were so frustrated with the rules. It took, remember, 1912 had passed, so the first election of the Senate was 1914. A third of the Senate was up. And then 1916, the second third. And in 1917, now that 2/3 were popularly elected, what did they want to do? Change the rules of the Senate. And they changed the rules of the Senate from this to this. What was prior to 1917 was, in order to pass a bill in the United States Senate, every senator had to agree to vote. Can you imagine in your legislature if every House member had to agree to vote before there was a vote? How many votes would you have? Not many. You'd have some, because there'd be things you have to do, and everybody knew you had to do. You had to make a decision, but there'd be something else that they'd want to get their vote to allow you to vote on your thing. But very few things would be considered. And that's what happened. So Wilson and the progressives were pushing hard for more legislation, and the Senate came through and said, okay, we're going to make, instead of everybody agreeing, 2/3 had to agree. It was called cloture. That is now 60%. The filibuster was ended by cloture. That's 2/3 of the Senate, now 60% of the Senate votes for cloture, then you can pass any bill. But unless you have 60 votes on a normal bill, other than reconciliation with a tax bill, other than that, every bill considered before the United States Senate needs 60 votes to pass. And that's why we don't have government-run health care. That's why we don't have a whole bunch of things in this country. Because there's only 3 times in the history of the country, one party has had a supermajority in the United States Senate. There's only been 3 times since 1917, since they put that cloture rule in. You know what that 3 times were? The New Deal, the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson, and Obamacare. So what does that tell you? That any time the Democrats had the power to get what they wanted to pass, as soon as they had that, they put through huge big government programs. Well, the Democrats know that they'll never get to 60 again, probably in a lifetime, because the country's changed. And so what do you hear them talking about? Eliminating the filibuster. And here's what will happen. I not predict you, I promise you, this is what will happen 4 years from now. If they win. They will eliminate the filibuster. They will pack the court with 12 or 13 members, so they will control, the court will do whatever they tell them to do. They will admit D.C. and Puerto Rico as states, so the Senate will never, ever have a majority, a supermajority, maybe even a majority of Republicans in the Senate. They will pass the John Lewis Voting Act, maybe worse, which will strip all the authority of the states to control your elections, and everything will be decided by Washington, D.C. And Republicans will never control anything in your lifetime or your children's. save something horrible happening. That is what you're stopping. And people say, well, I'm worried about a runaway convention. First, let me ask you, does anybody in this room believe that our country is not heading to a fiscal collapse? Raise your hand if you do not believe that. Okay? How certain are you? Are you absolutely certain? Anybody not absolutely certain that at some point we're going to have that collapse? Raise your hand. Okay. If that's the case, then what are you risking by having a convention that does one thing? Propose amendments. Doesn't pass amendments. Doesn't ratify amendments. It simply proposes an amendment. That's the risk. Your house is burning down. You know it's going to burn to the ground. You're standing across the street. You take the risk of crossing the street to put your house out. Because that's what we're talking about here. And by the way, it's not Fifth Avenue in New York. This is not a busy street. There's not a lot of risk here. Because all we're doing is giving you, the state legislatures, the power that Congress has today. Congress can propose amendments today to do anything, run away, do whatever they want to do. Why don't they do it? They have the right to do it. You know why they don't do it? Because they couldn't ratify anything crazy that they wanted to do. Congress only proposes amendments when there's broad consensus to get things done. Why? Because they know how hard it is to pass something and get it ratified. What are you afraid of? You have a tremendous responsibility in the Constitution. You have the responsibility of checking the federal government, and you did so for 130 years thanks to your role in the United States Senate. And for the last 110 years, you have abdicated that role. And look at what the heck's happened in this country. And so I'm here to plead with you to talk to your colleagues and get this done in South Dakota.